All right. Thanks everyone for joining. I know it's been a long day, so thanks everyone for coming down. Joined by a great panel today. As the MC introduced, so I'm Halcyon, I work at Chainlink Labs, head of derivatives there. Maybe to kick things off, we can start by just going along the panel and everyone introducing themselves, what protocol you're working at and what role.
I'm the ecosystem lead over at Aragon, so we build DAO infrastructure, hence relevant topic for us.
Hey guys, Gabriel from Mental Network. We are a Ethereum Layer 2 optimistic rollup, hyperscalable and DAO governed.
Hey y'all, I'm Bogdan from Mental Labs. We are a stable token protocol on top of the Celo blockchain, and I'm the CTO and co-founder.
Perfect, many thanks. So the topic for today's panel is overcoming challenges for stablecoin governance. Maybe to kick things off, I'd love to start off with which components of a stablecoin's mechanism do you think it's most critical to remain decentralized?
I think from my perspective, we had a lot of panels today here, and I would say the risk profile, specifically the fragmentation of it, right? So we have ideas of real world assets and different types of collateral, and there is an associated risk profile and also return profile that relates to that. So the ability to isolate those and have a unified liquidity is something that should be decentralized.
Yeah, because funny enough, that's also where decentralization and centralization tends to appear, because you have assets that require you to have more centralization in your protocol, right? But I think someplace that's, for me personally, non-negotiable is the censorship resistance aspect of it. I'm not a fan of adding blacklists to your smart contracts. I'd rather look to things more like the associative sets and privacy pools and things like that to disincentivize bad actors or limit them, but have a censorship-resistant stable token.
Yeah, I think also to add on to that, it's mainly around the peg stability mechanism as well, the risk parameters with regard to maybe the fees and balancing the incentives for both the voters and as well as the token holders. So yeah, there's two different models. One's a single token, dual token, and yeah, I think having this as a decentralized and transparent governance is really key to aligning incentives with both token holders that want to receive fees from the protocol as well as token holders who want stability of the protocol. I think that's very important.
Just follow on that. I think that's one of the reasons why we are specifically excited about stablecoin governance over at Aragon, because that's a use case where you actually really need on-chain coordination, because you have myriad of different stakeholders and the incentives and the risk-reward profiles that they strive for are different. So yeah, it's not just about how do we manage a grants program. It's about actually running the protocol and evolving it in such a way that everyone can benefit from it.
Yeah, so I think you both raised some really interesting points there. So some protocols take the approach that they want to actually disentangle governance and utility benefits, because they have some members of the DAO who are more focused in providing or participating in governance decisions, and some who are just there for I don't know, collecting APY, right? So what are maybe some trade-offs between a dual token model where you separate those benefits of utility and governance, and why might you go for a single token model where those two things are conflated?
Yeah, I feel one way to look at it is that if you have a separate model, then you're trying to price the governance tokens just in terms of governance, and this in times of instability can cause your system to be more like security. Be able to be taken over, right? Because the governance token loses in value. Whether if you have them both, then your utility kind of sets a lower bound to how that token can be priced and can help with security.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think also to add on to that, it's mainly around like the onboarding of like new collateral assets, right? So even though like we have assets that can yield very high returns, but the risk profile, as you mentioned, is very different for each asset. So being aligned with the stability of the protocol really falls down to like what kind of collateral you have, how secure is collateral, is there any risk of DPEG of any of these assets? So yeah.
What do you mean utility? Is there a token with utility? No, I mean, like that thing aside, I think, from the coordination side of things, like someone who's collecting fees is a stakeholder. And one of the things that we've seen in the space, so for example, Lido is the biggest user of our infrastructure, and like we are very closely looking at the dual governance model that they want to introduce. And like part of that is that you end up in a situation where the main provider of financial capital, which is the ETH stakers, might not overlap with the holders of the LDO token, and then you need to introduce another mechanics. So I think having just the utility token, or being a sizable and important stakeholder without having governance power, doesn't really work.
Yeah, and I think you were touching on it, but the users of the stable token users will always be kind of underrepresented in governance in a lot of these systems. I think they will kind of be represented by intermediaries, like maybe wallets or other players that kind of act as a node aggregator between them and the stable token platform. But them in itself as end users will always be a bit underrepresented, I think.
Yeah, and we saw that a lot in back in 2017 when Bitcoin forked, and forks are a form of governance we're not experimenting enough with. But when Bitcoin forked, the user was represented by basically the large exchanges and vendors that were on ramps for those users.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned just before some different solutions maybe for. I know it's a subjective term, but the idea of naive token holders to basically make sure that those tokens are being allocated towards governance decisions. I mean, we see many different models of this, right? Whether it be delegating votes to people who you consider experts, right? Are there any kind of unique approaches to this that have caught your eye that you think have been especially effective?
Yeah, I think I really like how Maker does it. I think they have designed a very cohesive experience for both the governance users, and I think it's being able to delegate your votes to someone who is more sophisticated and educated on the topic. I think that's very powerful in terms of getting more people to vote, essentially, because in my time in doing research, we found that a lot of DAOs actually have really, really low user participation, within the range of 5%. And MakerDAO, it's around 10 to 12%, which is actually one of the leading DAOs. And I think it's more of how we can improve the user experience for higher participation, to reduce the number of hoops that users have to jump through, just so that they can participate in governance decisions that may affect their token price or the protocol that they are most beloved to.
Yeah, I mean, Maker is Maker was incepted as an idea before the Ethereum network went live, so they're the oldest DAO as such in existence. And I think one of the really cool elements, because you mentioned delegates, one of the really cool elements there is the auto undelegation, which basically means you would never be grandfathered into being a delegate in perpetuity. So that creates some need for accountability towards the token holders that delegate to you. But another element, which I think is the reason why Maker enjoys higher participation, is they are actually a sustainable DAO, as in they have revenue that is higher than their burn rate. So there is some going concern value in that DAO, A, and B, you're actually voting on parameters that relate to the protocol, right? It's not again, it's not just a grants fund, right? I think like a lot of the roll-ups that are now shaping up as DAOs, like they would see participation increase once control of the sequencers gets transferred towards like a decentralized governance model. But at the moment, it's like, here's some money to play with and pretend to be a DAO. No, pretend, but like, here's some money to play DAO with.
Yeah, very interesting. I think one other thing I wanted to ask were, so I think we already uncovered maybe some incentive schemes that have worked particularly well to increase engagement, especially with makers you mentioned. What are the main trade-offs that exist between, next one. With the emergence of RWA-backed stablecoins, and you mentioned this earlier, right? How do you manage the tension between censorship resistance and compliance? Like I know you mentioned like isolated, like
yeah,
pools.
I mean, looking at what Maker's doing, right, with like having a sub-DAO structure where you have different isolation of centralization, basically, in your whole infrastructure, is kind of like the way to go. You always have to interact with these elements, like, I don't know, be it Open Eden for T-bills or other sort of like securities. It's impossible to really remove this without like also incurring a lot of other risks. Like there are decentralized versions of these like financial instruments coming, but they tend to always have a catch to them, you know, like either it's a form of like lending market that then gives you the yield of the T-bill, but then you're like exposing yourself to liquidity issues or blah, blah. But like if you want to really have that risk profile, you need to be centralized to some extent, or you're always going to have to play this game.
I think at this point, everyone's just trying to push the boundaries, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't know what the regulators will do. And I think it's also beneficial that we work together with the regulators to sort of figure out a framework for what's right, what's wrong, what can we do, what can't we do. And yeah, I think like for us, we've been working with Ondo Finance to onboard USDY into Mantle. And there's a lot of comparisons being made between like other RWA-backed stablecoins, and we find that Ondo's method of doing it is pretty robust. And I think like it's more of how best can we work together with the regulators to figure out something that is beneficial for everyone, like both the users as well as from a risk profile standpoint as well.
Yeah, and I chatted a bit with Cassidy from Centrifuge, and like they're one of the projects that has dealt with RWAs for the longest time. And I mean, ultimately, to touch RWAs, you need a legal wrapper, and then that in itself already means that no matter how much governance you introduce, like there is someone who's responsible for those assets in meat space, and they're a conduit of enacting or executing whatever actions you vote for. So knowing and recognizing that limitation is essential for us to be able to have a more honest conversation around like, okay, like this structure intrinsically, because of the way that or the need to interact with meat space cannot be meeting our decentralization ideals. And Rune had like a very good contrast of like what is practical and useful for people versus what is the idealistic version of how things should work. And like we should be more objective about this, and that's why I actually love this conference, because like people here have a very sober view of that balance and trade-offs.
I also think it should be really made clear to like the users, especially like what risk does this stablecoin actually have? Because like we say RWA-backed stablecoins, but each one is essentially very different. Like some are backed by short-term T-bills, iShares, or yeah, there's different designs, but the underlying asset is could be the same, might be the same, but it's actually pretty different. So I think like educating the users on the differences between all these RWA-backed stablecoins as to what the collateral is, I think is very important as well.
Yeah, and on that, I think I always like to talk about this. Like, we call USDC a fiat-based stable token, but it's actually a credit-backed stable token in reality. And like, we saw that when the bank crisis happened, and then like we saw the USDC get a 10% haircut for a bit, and then come back. And it's funny, yeah. And I think it's interesting to build things more composable on top of these different risk profiles. Like in Mento, we have USDC in the reserve, we have DAI in the reserve, we have Bitcoin, we have Ether. We're looking at more real-world assets like carbon credits and also real estate. And we're trying to build this more diversified risk profile for the ultimate stable token.
How can folks who are participating in those protocols gain more, like I think both yourself and Gabe just called this out, gain more transparency, especially for stablecoins that are backed by RWAs, right? I mean, I think some people ultimately think and speculate about what is backing, but they don't fully know. So like, how can you enable like greater transparency?
I guess being able to inform the users well on all socials and like just having like a disclaimer as to what is actually backing this asset. I think oftentimes like we see in DeFi, a lot of the protocols, especially like DEXs, if let's say like the RWA is like permissionless and it's tradable, it's like a wrapper, right? I think that there should be more ways that we can display like, okay, this is the risk profile for this asset, this is the risk profile of this asset. You should know what you're investing in or what you're trading or yeah, more about education.
I think there's something to be added here, like, you know, transparency in and of itself is nice, but it doesn't really tell the story. Like, we have a lot of data on chain, like, but are people looking at it, right? I think there's something to be said about having a counterparty that has skin in the game with you, that kind of is incentivized to also keep you accountable, like ask the right questions, highlight the right information, but also it's not on the same side at the table as you are. I think that's something that we see in the space a bit, but we need more of.
That's a brilliant point, because we've had this like, oh, it's so transparent, it's on chain, and it's like it's the opposite of transparent. It's obscurified by noise, right? Like the ability to surface relevant information is important, and just by dumping everything on chain, that doesn't solve the problem. It makes it worse. Thank you. Woo. Yeah, one of the ways that we think about things related to increasing transparency and accountability to a certain extent is just, you need more granularity. Yesterday, Mateusz from Polygon was giving this example of, within the Cosmos ecosystem, you have like the most important technical upgrade of the protocol and someone asking for $3,000 to create YouTube videos. Like, those two decisions are decided by the exact same stakeholders, and they go through the same process. And we cannot ask from people to like be up to speed in detail on every topic that pertains to a certain stablecoin, right? Like, we want granularity on the decision-making side. Where we want, to avoid granularity is on the liquidity side, right? So you have to have this like ideally unified liquidity at the top, but when it comes to decisions and like maintaining relevant context, you want to allow people to specialize.
You talked about people having skin in the game, who are invested in actually bringing transparency. Who are some of these stakeholders? What are some examples?
So I don't know, this is just off the top of my head, but let's say you have DAI as a stable token, right? And then you have a money market like Compound or Aave built on top of it, right? I think Aave and Compound are then incentivized to make sure that DAI is being maintained how it should be, right? And you get these sort of relationships that get built, and those are important because, yeah, if we just are transparent about like this is my report, but there's nobody really looking at what's happening behind it, then yeah.
So you think it should be driven by like composable products who are or dApps that are basically building upon or interacting with, and then should there with the idea of third-party auditors or anything like that, provides greater transparency. Like, is it necessary for that information to also be on chain?
Sorry, what do you mean that information to be on chain?
So you mentioned, for example, like an audit of records that show like I have this amount of money in a bank account, or actually have access to these these assets off chain through this brokerage or something like that. Are those sorts of reports?
We have third-party auditors and these sort of reports in meat space, and we all lived through. I mean, some of people here are young, but we've lived through the 2007 situation where something rated AAA ended up being junk. So I mean, without like skin in the game, without actual economic downside for the person or the entity that issues this audit, like it's a piece of paper, it's a rubber stamp, it's useless.
Yeah, sorry, this is exactly what I was getting at. I mean, like, does that actually, like that, some people call that more transparency, like is that helpful, or is it not actually seen as additional transparency if you think the water is corruptible or?
Yeah, I think like this is the principal agent situation, right? Like, I think ideally we should make sure that people that have decision-making power are principals. We should try to, blockchains, disintermediation. I think this is a level that we haven't explored enough yet, which is just make sure everybody's a principal.
I wanted to come back to a comment Gabe made just before, like specifically about like USDY. So I wanted to kind of move the conversation to when governance moves cross-chain, right? Like, what are some of the implications for like how that can affect governance? So like with like Ondo, for example.
I think the issue comes when you bring a token off to different chains, right? Because each chain ideally should be a isolated market to some sense. Because like if, let's say, we can mint a lot of USDY or any RWA stablecoin, and there's like some exploit that allows a user or a hacker to mint a lot more of these stablecoins, and then bridge it back to a different chain, and then like basically wipe all the liquidity pools on like say Mantle or Ethereum. I think it's difficult to say because like yeah, sorry, what was the?
I suppose I can rephrase the question as like,
Yeah.
have you seen any effective like cross-chain governance mechanisms for like stablecoin protocols? And like, if so, like, what do you think
Sure.
has made those governance systems effective?
I think one way to do it is sort of to isolate the minting and burning mechanism, right? So you're not actually bridging the token over, but you're minting it on that chain and you're burning it on that chain to then move it to a different chain. So not exactly bridging over to a different chain and wrapping that token again and again, like through like a canonical bridge or something.
Yeah, and I think Angular is a good example of this. Like they have their buy and sell module on Ethereum and the CDP module as well, but on other chains that they go to, they just deploy the CDP module to make it simpler so that burning and minting happen isolated. Because if not, it's not just about governance, but you need to really think about where your collateral lives and how you bridge that. And if you, for example, I don't know, have like wrapped versions of collateral on other chains, then you kind of go down this weird rabbit hole. You actually need to go through sexes if you really want to bridge collateral effectively, right? And and also I think governance cross-chain becomes a bit of a technical nightmare when you want people to actually understand what's happening, and then you also wrap that into a secondary transaction that executes in a different context. It's like, just even as a developer, like I have to like really struggle to understand Curve's governance proposal sometime. I guess as a more end user, that's just doesn't happen. Yeah. Yeah,
I think I mean some of us suffered the trying to like bridge USDC back from Harmony after the bridge hack, and it was a fun experience. Like, what is it, 3 cents to the dollar, or so. So I think like there is definitely something around like segregation of the liquidity and like the burn and mint on different chains, and like having the native token there, like or minting the stablecoin as a native token on each chain instead of just a representation. And then just on like the protocol governance side, we are working with Layer 0. Irene is going to speak on the next panel on like enabling to have this like consistent process flow of controlling implementations across chain through like one unified process, and having stakeholders across chains participate in like a consistent flow so that you mitigate opportunities for exploiting, because like the multisig that deploys the decision on Arbitrum is faster than the one that deploys on Manto, and like someone can arb that and exploit your system in some way, shape, or form. Whereas like now that and CCIP that Aave is using is like another way of approaching and solving for the same problem, like ensuring that you can pass and execute instructions consistently across multiple EVMs.
So I think you've like rightly called out bridging as like one friction or limitation to like cross-chain governance. What are some other frictions that you've observed that limit like governance participation?
I mean, I think we still don't have really good UIs for governance, to be fair, like, especially for more complex governance. Like we have Tally that kind of encompasses all the one token, one vote, but if we look like VE models, that's still mostly snapshot and multisigs, which is, yeah, it's 2023, come on, man. Yeah, and of course we have like Curve's initial implementation of governance, which is just, yeah.
Curve is built on Aragon, by the way.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Just a plug. But yeah, I agree. And like part of the reason why we're not seeing more complex governance emerge on chain is cost, right? Like trying to compute like VE-based governance on chain. Like I'm not gonna pay like $150 just to vote. That's absurd. Like unless you have a really substantial stack in a project, right? So part of the reason why we created this multi-chain governance model is we take token balances across EVMs. We execute the actual vote on zk sync, and then we bring that. The vote takes place on zk sync, and then we bring down the instructions and execution. So we're working towards bringing that flexible, granular governance experience on chain, so that you can not rely on multisigs all the time.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I think to your point about granularity is that sometimes a lot of the stakeholders that have skin in the game, like liquidity providers, they are unable to vote most of the time. And they are the ones that are holding most of the liquidity and allowing people to trade back and forth. So I think one thing that is sort of interesting that I find is like the frax model. It's kind of the fractional voting model, allowing LPs to vote, allowing people who have pretty much stake in the game to essentially vote with their stake positions, liquidity positions, and yeah.
Yeah. Like one of the challenges that we've had, which hopefully granularity will resolve, is we have this concept of community or token holders, and I mean in meat space we call those stakeholders because they're like distinct groups that have a distinct relationship with the protocol. And when we talk about stakeholder diversity in our space, it's not about demographic belonging, right? It's about like how are you interacting with the protocol. So for example, like the graph has this schema where depending on your role, you have a different multiplier on your token balance, right? So to make sure that people that have different roles and fulfill different functions have like an accurate representation.
I agree.
Yeah, and a bit tangential to this, but I really like the bicameral model of the OP governance as well, this idea of having a token room and a citizenship room, and actually trying to do the one person, one vote thing. I think that's really cool, and I would like to see more innovation in that space. Like we do have quadratic voting now on Gitcoin for the grants, but like seeing more of that go to governance normally as well would be cool.
Yeah, like I mean, one of the things that you mentioned about like LPs and stakeholders, like one of the reasons why delegation is so dominant as a governance form, it's not only because individual voters that cannot maintain confidence and blah blah blah, like they can delegate to someone who can. Like that's one part of it, but it's the one that we talk more about. Like the actual bigger driver is that large token holders, like funds, they keep their bag in a cold wallet and they cannot vote. So that's why you need delegation, and that's why protocols are like pushing more and more to like have delegation in there. It's not necessarily like the first thing that we focus a lot on. It's also the second one.
Yeah, and the Stellar network, at least having a different voting address than your holding address was one of the first thing implemented because, yeah, it was a clear need for that.
Yeah, because it's an actual pain point. It's not about ideology. It's like there is A16s that cannot vote because you don't have delegation, and you know their tokens are with the custodian.
So I think we've covered some of the friction, some of the limitations, some of the key innovations that we're seeing that are driving more active engagement. Maybe as a last question before we get a Q&A, like what do you think the end game looks like for stablecoin governance?
Oh, that's a tough one. I honestly don't know. I think and I shouldn't, right? If we know what the end game would look like, we would have it. I think we've suffered a lot from people that think that they know what it looks like and don't adjust course along the way. But also, I think that we are thankfully seeing more and more experimentation. We see an entire new segment of stablecoins emerging that are backed by staked ETH. So yeah, I'm excited to see what it is, and hopefully will help these teams experiment.
Yeah, I think on the governance side that we don't really know the end game, but I guess there's a lot to improve on to begin with, like UI UX, getting more voter participation, getting more people to delegate their votes to someone who knows how to vote or has the knowledge to vote. So I think it's like just clearing this low-hanging fruits, right?
I honestly just want people to get enough utility from them and so that they're actually excited about participating in governance. I would like to see that idea, and of course more on-chain governance for sure.
Okay, I think we're coming up on time based on the clock. Maybe we can go to the floor. Are there any questions that we have for this great panel on stablecoin governance? Nope. All right. Well, thank you to this great panel. Really appreciate it, and thanks all for yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.